Hey everybody. So today we are going to talk about stretching. Pretty hot topic, and has been for a really long time in the exercise science, kinesiology, rehab fields of study. So we're going to go through a few things today that should hopefully help you feel a little bit more confident about this correct question. Should I stretch or should I not stretch? Okay. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be discussing today. So the initial discussion is what do you think? Right. So we'll get to that slide in just a second. And I want you to stop and take a second about what you think. And obviously, if we're in class together, we're going to discuss this out loud. Since that's not the case, then you can just write down some questions that you have, and hopefully they'll be answered in the lecture. And then if not, you can answer them or ask those questions afterwards. We're going to do a little muscle structure functioning review. If this is your first time talking about that stuff, don't worry. I'm going to make it really simple. And then if you were to get into an anatomy class or an upper level exercise science class like exercise physiology or biomechanics, then we kind of take that to the next level. But you don't need that type of experience to understand this information. We're going to talk about two specific types of stretching that are very popular and the ones that are most researched. Tissue performance requirements. What are some things and sports and goals that people have when we're trying to perform, and what do they need their muscles to be able to do? And then we'll talk about how stretching affects that. We'll look at a little bit of the research on stretching, and then we'll kind of come to some conclusions and maybe do some discussion at the end. Okay, so initial discussion. What do you think about stretching? Have you done it? My guess is many of you have. Why do you stretch and what is the purpose? So what I would like you to do is, stop the lecture right here, write down some things that you think about stretching. Don't look forward in the slides. I want you to kind of make your own assumptions at this point. You're welcome to look some stuff up on Google, or just kind of use what you know. If you've experienced stretching or you've done stretching or you do stretching in your sports or your personal workouts, why do you do it? What is the purpose behind the stretching? And maybe what have you been told about stretching? Maybe some people have told you why you stretch or why you should stretch. So take a few minutes and pause here and write down just some various questions you might have or some thoughts you might have on stretching. Okay, so in order to kind of understand, should we stretch or should we not stretch, we need to kind of understand how muscles work. Okay, and so when we really do deep dives into muscle structure and function, we can get really, really complicated. Muscles are really, really cool how they function, and our understanding of how they work has just it kind of exploded over the last like 15 or 20 years. We just keep finding out more stuff about muscles. I really love muscle structure and function. It's one of my areas of passion. I like to learn about this stuff, but we're going to keep it simple. Okay. So, in order to keep it simple, there are some things we need to understand. First and foremost, compliance. What is compliance? Compliance is a word that we can use for lots of things, not just muscles. It's the degree to which something yields or bends or conforms. So if you take a look at the picture in the bottom left-hand corner, it's like a spoon, right? And this has happened, I can remember being in middle school and playing around with a with a pencil. I'm sitting there and, I've got ADHD. So of course, this happened to me a lot. I'm sitting there and I'm like, and my pencil just breaks and I have to get a new one because I'm playing around with it too much. That's compliance. So pencils, in this example, don't have very good compliance. They can bend just a little bit until they snap, right? So muscles have quite a bit of compliance. You would call them semi-compliant tissue. Muscles are also what we call viscoelastic. Vis, Viscoelastic. That is spelled wrong. I apologize for that. They are not visoelastic. They are viscoelastic. Viscoelastic, viscoelastic, viscoelastic. There, I said it 3 times. There's a C missing here. Sorry about that. What that word means is they are fluid elastic. So think of like just grabbing a bunch of rubber bands and wrapping it with maybe some of that like plastic stuff that you have in your kitchen that you can put over dishes and stuff to keep them. And then filling it with fluid, or just imagine a balloon filled with rubber bands and water. That's kind of what muscles are. They're semi-rigid, so they're a lot like a spring. And the reason I'm explaining this to you is because muscles are comprised of this really stretchy material and water, fluid, cellular fluid. When muscles move, they should be able to comply or bend or yield when we need them to, but then we need them to go back to where they were. So I'm going to use a balloon. I'm going to use a balloon in several examples today. So I'm going to press on this balloon. It has some compliance, right? It has some compliance. It's bending. It's doing what I need to, right? And then boop, it goes back to where I need it. Okay. Now, depending on what you need for a sport, maybe I need to change the compliance of this balloon. Maybe I need it to be able to go further. Maybe I need the range for it to go in and out to be greater, depending on what I need, or maybe I need it to be able to go top to bottom. We can do that with our muscles. We can kind of change the compliance, which we'll talk about. And so in this example, we're looking at Lexi Thompson, one of the best women golfers in the world. And you can see that she has quite a bit of compliance in the muscles in her upper back. She can twist. You can see her knees are pointing directly at us, so she can twist quite a bit. She needs that for her sport. She needs to be able to twist so she can develop a lot of force in that spring-loaded mechanism in her muscles, so she can unleash a 300-yard drive. She will drive it further than I ever will be able to, and it's fun to watch. Okay, so next up, this slide, it has a lot going on it, but I'm going to explain it step by step. So viscoelastic, simpler way of saying that, muscles are sacks of fluid surrounded by semi-compliant tissue, okay? Muscles are activated by your nerves. Simply put, the wires that come from the computer of your body. Can you guess where your computer is? Where is the computer that runs your body? Boop, it's your brain, right? So your brain and your spinal cord, that's what's called your central nervous system. And then out of that central nervous system comes nerves, which they pass electricity through nerves, and that's what turns your muscles on. Now, there's a lot more that's complicated to that process, and we talk about that in other classes. But for our purposes in this lecture, nerves turn on muscles. They tell them what to do, how much force to apply. So that when you say activated or turned on by nerves, the more force you need, the more electricity from the nerves you get. Okay. Now, as muscles move, there are a couple different things that are happening. There's a mechanical process that's actually inside the muscles, a microscopic process called actin and myosin. And actin and myosin are these microscopic proteins that are designed to be a machine inside the muscle. And when they connect with each other, basically they're like moving Velcro almost, right? These proteins connect with one another and they create force. And one of the best ways I've come up with describing kind of what this is like is with another type of machine that's a lot of you are probably familiar with, or at least you've seen. This is a ratchet strap, and you use them on trucks, or I use them in my Jeep or on my dad's truck if I really need to tie something down tight. And you don't need to know that in particular, but the way this machine works is it's got some pegs on the inside of it here. It rotates and it connects to itself by a ratcheting motion. Now, on one side, a strap will come out, and then you put another strap inside here, and it just eventually tightens it down. That's fairly similar to how actin and myosin work. They connect with one another, and they create this force. So we have this electrical activation. We have this machine that's inside the muscle. So this is part of the viscoelastic tissue that I'm talking about. This actin and myosin isn't this hard stuff. It does connect with each other, and it does create force, but it's also semi-elastic too. It's compliant. So it can create force and it can stretch at the same time, which is really cool. And another thing that I feel like is a good way to explain how this works in real time. So we could use an ultrasound or something to see inside the muscle, which is really cool if you ever get a chance to see that. But what actually happens when a muscle kind of comes together and goes apart, right? So if I've got my bicep, I'm bringing it together. If you feel that, it's really hard. And then if I extend my elbow out, my muscle tissue lengthens. Well, what happens is there's a fluid shift because there's fluid inside there. And if you think about an earthworm, that is very similar to how your muscle is acting. So when an earthworm scrunches up, all this fluid goes to different segments of the earthworm. So you can kind of look at that top picture there. And then when it spreads out, all the fluid also spreads out, but the compartment of the earthworm hasn't changed. So the actual that on the outside of an earthworm, an earthworm is a hydrostatic skeleton. So the outside, which is basically its skeleton, doesn't really change. It's the fluid on the inside that shifts, which is a lot like what our muscles do, or like the balloon. So if I press on one side of the balloon, the other side of the balloon has to shift because the fluid or the air inside is shifted. That's very similar to what your muscles do. Okay. The difference is between the earthworm and the balloon is on the inside of your muscles, you have this actin and myosin machine that gives you an added benefit of force production, which we talk a lot about in our exercise science classes. And we will hopefully, if you get into those classes, you'll learn more about. Okay. So we have an understanding of how muscles work. They are these viscoelastic tissues that can be compliant, right? And so compliance means that they're able to yield, that they're able to stretch and go to certain lengths that we need them to be able to, and then come back to resting length. Now, resting length is something that when we start talking about stretching is important, because resting length for a gymnast who needs to be able to literally put their head on the ground while they're touching their toes, that's a different requirement than maybe some other sport where you don't have to be as flexible. And so in order to start this conversation, we need to understand two of the most researched types of stretches. Okay, static and dynamic stretching. Whenever we say something is static, it is non-moving. Okay, so a good example of static is this strap. It has absolutely it has pretty much zero compliance to it. So it's non-moving. So when we use the term static in terms of stretching, basically what we mean is put your tissue in a position and hold it. So touching your toes. So bend over, touch your toes, and then don't move. Or maybe you're trying to just get lower in your toe touch, but it's an extremely slow process. Or maybe a lot of you've done the rear deltoid stretch, the rear shoulder stretch, where you kind of go like this and you can feel the stretch in the back of your shoulder. Now, I'm not moving here. I'm just putting my shoulder in a specific position and I'm holding. Maybe I'm doing some breathing. So that's static stretching, something I'm sure many of you have experience with. Then there's dynamic stretching, which is different than static stretching, because now we're talking about dynamic would be joint movement, would be movement of the muscles repeatedly, shortening and lengthening. So this, I'm going to try not to shake my computer too much. This would be more dynamic, back and forth, back and forth. So I'm actually shortening and lengthening that same muscle back here that I was stretching a second ago, but now I'm shortening and lengthening it repeatedly. That's dynamic. Dynamic just means moving. Static means non-moving. Okay. So two types of stretches. So in order to kind of understand how static and dynamic stretching affects muscle tissue and what we need, we should probably talk about different goals, different sport specific goals, different exercise goals. So when we look at this stuff too, a lot of sports are going to have like in the middle requirements. There's not a lot of sports that just need explosive movements, and there's not a lot of sports that just require like maximum range of motion. A lot of sports require both. right? So when we think about like basketball, for example, basketball requires sprinting, jumping, throwing, moving heavy amounts of weight, body weight. So if you have like a 200-pound basketball player that can dunk the ball, that's 200 pounds that they have to move in the air over 10 feet, right? So that's very explosive. And that's going to also require a level of flexibility, a level of range of motion at the joints, right? If you're just looking at this picture at the very top, um, he has to put his body in a certain position in order to achieve what he's wanting to do with the ball, right? He has to have that shoulder back. He's going to have to bring it over his head. He's going to have to bend his body in a certain way to achieve that dunk, right? So basketball players do need to be flexible, right? But it's a range. It's a range. So range is something that has two ends to it. Okay. There are lots of lessons in life that we can use ranges for, right? The ranges are in politics, Democrat, Republican, right? And unfortunately, sometimes those ranges get really spread apart. That is for another lecture. But ranges are great to talk about flexibility as well. So when we talk about a gymnast like Simone Biles, she needs to be like, if this is hyper flexibility here and this is very little to no flexibility, most people are probably going to want to be in the middle, but Simone Biles has to. In order to compete at the level that she wants to compete at in gymnastics, she has to be all the way over here. She has to be at the very end. She has to be able to put her joints in certain positions that she needs so she can achieve those elite levels of performance in gymnastics. She also has to be extremely explosive. She has to be very quick and fast when she does her floor routines. So there are different ranges. Right now, we're talking about ranges of flexibility. There's ranges of power. There's ranges of strength. There's lots of different ranges in human performance. But we're talking about stretching today, right? Now, when we talk about sports performance, usually you aren't going to get away from talking about injuries. It's a natural part of performing. You don't even have to perform in sports. You could just be doing weightlifting in the weight room, or you could be doing some conditioning, running on the treadmill, and you might get hurt. Okay, so at that point, you might visit a physical therapist, an athletic trainer, and they are going to help you get your tissues, your muscle tissues, and your connective tissues, like your tendons and your ligaments, depending on what's damaged. They're going to help you get that back, right? They're going to help you get that back to a place and repair that tissue, put you through different exercises to help repair that tissue so you can get back to doing what you need. So when we talk about tissue performance requirements, when I say tissue, I mean muscle. Maybe you need to be explosive. Maybe you need to be extremely bendy and stretchy, or maybe you're injured and you need to repair that tissue, right? And then there's, human beings are not these perfectly symmetrically structured things. A lot of people, like for myself example, I have my left glute, like my left butt muscle is way less stretchy than my right? And my left hamstring is way less stretchy than my right one. Actually, the left side of my body is a little stiffer than the right. So that's what the last point down at the bottom there is. Even if you're not injured, maybe you need to pay attention to parts of your body compared to other parts of your body. So this muscle back here, my rear deltoid on my right side, I don't have to pay as much attention to because I can stretch pretty well with that side, but I do have to pay a little bit more attention to my left because the left side of my body is a little stiffer just because of things that I've done in my life that have actually kind of twisted my body a little bit. And humans are like that. We're not these like super hard structured things. We're compliant. So over time, things change. And so you might need to have some specific attention to specific parts of your body. Most people do, depending on what they're trying to do. Okay, so effects of stretching, static versus dynamic. Okay, the big question. This is the one that has been the most researched over the years. I mean, stretching has been a focus of research since like the 1950s, right? People have always wondered, what is the effect of stretching? Is it going to make me perform better? Is it going to make me perform worse? And what type of stretching is the best for what I need to do? And those questions I just, the things that I just said, you can research each one of them for years, right? And they have been doing that, right? One of the biggest things is what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve, right? When you go out on the court, when you go out on the field, or when you just go into the gym or whatever, what are you trying to achieve? And those questions, if you answer those, can help you decide a little bit about what type of stretching to do. So static stretching in particular, it can increase the repeated word tissue. Sorry about that. It can increase the resting length of tissue and compliance over time. What does that mean? Today, I can maybe bend over and touch my shins, right? That's as far as I can get on my toe touch. Now I can get a little bit further than that. I'm not super flexible, but I can get a little further than that. But let's say, for example, I can touch my shins. But maybe I want to play in a pickup basketball league, or I want to do some flag football. I'm not going to do tackle football anymore. That's for younger people. Or maybe I need to be able to move my hips better in my golf swing. So I want to increase the compliance of my hamstrings, right? Then maybe I'd practice my toe touch a couple times a day. So the resting length, when I'm not doing anything dynamic, when I'm not moving, just trying to do a toe touch, I can increase that over time. Okay, so that effectively what that's doing, remember that muscles are these viscoelastic tissues, right? So you've got a muscle, let's say this is a muscle, it could be any muscle in your body. Over time, you're not particularly changing the level of fluid in the tissue, you're just changing the shape of the tissue, right? So these balloons have relatively the same amount of fluid in them. I think maybe one has a little bit more air, but let's just say for our purposes, they have the same amount of air. I started out with this, and now I've changed it to this. Same amount of fluid, but now I've changed the compliance because the tissue is a different shape. So that's what static stretching can do for you over time. So my hamstrings go from maybe kind of shorter and stiffer to longer and more compliant. So now I can touch my, my knuckles to the ground, my palms to the ground, like Simone Biles. Another thing that static stretching can do is it's a parasympathetic stimulus. Ooh, what does that mean? Science has some really cool words, right? I think so. Well, parasympathetic basically just means you're relaxed. If you've ever done a workout, especially like a harder workout, and then afterwards you're kind of sitting around and you feel that, and then maybe you feel like you want to fall asleep. Eating a big meal has a parasympathetic stimulus, right? Parasympathetic stimulus just means relax. And static stretching can do that. It can absolutely create a parasympathetic stimulus. It relaxes you and decreases muscle tone. Some people are just really jazzed up all the time. I'm one of those people. Just my muscles tend to be a little stiffer and a little tighter just because my nervous system is either really up or really down, right? So during the day, I tend to get, kind of just juiced up. And, I like to lecture. I'm very passionate in the classroom, but, sometimes I just need to, right? I need to let some of my muscles relax a little bit. And that's what static stretching can do for you too. And it can create greater range of motion in a joint, which could be helpful for sport specific purposes or just exercise purposes, or maybe just joint health. It's not healthy to have ultra stiff joints all the time where you can barely move, which tends to happen as people get older. So static stretching can have a lot of benefit for those things. But the big question is with static stretching is, do you need to change the shape of the balloon? There are lots of ways to get a parasympathetic stimulus besides static stretching. So if you don't need to static stretch, if you're in a place where you can perform where your tissue is at right now and you've got compliance that you need, doing static stretching might not be the thing for you. We'll talk about that in a minute. Dynamic stretching. A lot of you probably have experience with dynamic stretching. It's if you're doing high knees, if you're doing kind of some hopping, some skipping, some jumping, if you're doing maybe you're getting ready to do some heavy weightlifting, or you're getting ready for practice and your coach has you doing some explosive movements to get warmed up, right? That's dynamic stretching. Again, a dynamic stretching is moving. Yoga is dynamic stretching. Parts of yoga. Sometimes when you're doing a yoga routine, you're going to go through different types of static stretching and dynamic stretching. So if I were to, let's say, go into a lunge or a split stance position, and then I were to turn and try and turn my body, and then I return to a standing position, I do that over and over again. That would be dynamic stretching. So dynamic stretching has a lot of benefits. It increases acute compliance. So we get blood flow, a lot more blood flow during dynamic stretching. It warms. So what happens if I were to put this bad boy, like if I were to warm it up, if I were to put some steam on it, or maybe set it in a really warm room, it's going to get really stretchy. So dynamic stretching increases blood flow to the tissue, which is super important. I'd say it's one of the most important things before you go to do a work. This is why we do a warm up, blood flow. So that's going to increase compliance right away. Your tissues are going to become warm. The fluid inside is going to become warm. And now this, these are my finger motions for compliance. I'm just doing them as I'm talking. So this is extra compliance, right? So this is blood flow, right? And this is extra compliance. So think about silly putty in the microwave, right? You warm it up, it becomes stretchier. Don't leave it in there for too long. It'll ruin your microwave, right? Dynamic stretching also stimulates those, remember the wires, the nerves that come out of your computer, right? You need to stimulate those too, right? So the more you can stimulate the nerves, the better the electricity can flow in your body. And that's really important for muscle performance. So dynamic stretching can do that too. And it allows for more natural movement that might be more sport specific or more exercise specific. So if I'm getting ready to do like a deadlift, I might do some kettlebell swings to get my hips warmed up, or I might do some jumping, like a box jump or something like that. Or maybe I want to do some sprinting. I'm going to do some light jogging or some skipping. Those movements are really specific to my goals, and dynamic stretching can be really, really good for that. There's been a lot of positive research on dynamic stretching and dynamic movement compared to static stretching. And over time, you can actually get a lot of the benefit from dynamic stretching as you can from static. So that brings us to the effects of stretching in current research. So there are so many different research studies on stretching. This is one of my favorite, and you can Google this. Just Google the title. It's a free article. It's I think 2011, European Journal of Applied Physiology, a review of the acute effects of static and dynamic stretching on performance. Now, it's important to understand what that term acute means. ACUTE. Acute versus chronic. Acute is right away. What I'm going to do some stretching, and what happens to my vertical jump right after I do some static stretching, like almost immediately. Okay. Chronic is something that happens over a long period of time. So if you're that gymnast and you really, really need extra hamstring flexibility, your toe touch that you do 2 to 3 times a day over 6 weeks, that's a chronic effect. That's something that builds over time. Doing exercise routines over 6 or 8 weeks, you get chronic adaptations, things that change over a period of time. This study is looking at acute effects though. Okay, so what has happened in result from doing different types of stretching to whatever they looked at a lot of things here. So I just pulled up a couple of different charts here. And so if you were to look at this research study, it's one of my favorites, you would see these charts. Okay, and I have cited it at the top, so we're good. Not plagiarizing. That's bad news. So let's take a look at this. If we look down at the bottom, it's going to explain what the chart is telling us. We have number of measurements. We have impairment, non-significant change, and significant improvement. Okay, so we'll read down here. The number of measures from 20 studies encompassing 484 participants that reported the effect of static stretching on jump height. So that's important. This chart is all about jump height. And I should back up for a second and make a note that this is a review article. a review article. So what they did is they looked at, they looked at tons of studies that have been done over the years, and they put them all together and they looked at all the data. Okay. So that's why it says 20 studies, 484 participants. So they looked at all these different studies and they put a chart together to show us what happened. And it has to do with static stretching. So they had 484 people that did static stretching, and then they jumped. Okay. They did different types of jumps in the different studies. If you look down there at the very bottom, counter movement jump, a squat jump, drop jumps. There's lots of different studies with different types of jumps. So we can see that if you look on the very left-hand side, static stretching in a lot of the studies had caused significant impairment in performance in those different types of jumps. There were a lot of studies that showed non-significant change. There weren't very many that showed actual improvement from static stretching on different types of jumping. So they did static stretching, and then they went and did a type of jump, and did it improve the jump or did it not improve the jump? That's what that chart is telling us. And from that chart in particular, we can take away, looks like static stretching might not be the best thing to do if you're going to do a vertical jump, or you're going to do a long jump, or something where you need to be explosive in jumping in particular. This says nothing about any other type of exercise. Okay, so this chart is particularly about jumps, and that's important. And now the review does, the whole article does lots of different types of movements. Go read it. It's a cool article. Now take a look at figure 7 in the study. This is a dynamic stretch. Okay, so this gets a little confusing because they talk about force and torque. Okay, if you look along the left-hand side of the chart, percent change in force and torque. Okay, isokinetic power. That's, if you look down in the description down here, it says isometric force and torque, isokinetic power, and 1 repetition maximum. Something you guys might be familiar with, 1 RM, the most weight you can lift on maybe a squat, a bench, or a deadlift. Okay, what is this chart looking at? They did some dynamic stretching for a certain period of time. Did it improve the amount of force that they could apply with their muscles in different types of exercise? Lots of different types. So look at the one on the bottom left. They did dynamic stretching for about 30 seconds, anywhere between 0 and 30 seconds. It says there was one study that they looked at that did that for that certain amount of time, and it improved force output at the muscles a little bit. If you look at the 60 to 90 seconds, so that's a 1 to 1.5 minutes. They had 2 studies that looked at people doing dynamic stretching for 60 to 90 seconds, and there were a lot of studies that showed improvement there. So what can we take away from this chart? Dynamic stretching, if you're going to go and do something that requires a lot of force output, like a 1 rep max, or something that you really, really have to be fast and explosive with a lot of weight, dynamic stretching looks like it might be a little bit better than static stretching, just from these 2 charts. Again, I encourage you to read the article because it has a lot more of these charts for a lot more different conditions, a lot, different types of jumps, different types of stretching. It's a good article. All right, so lots of information, right? What do you think? This is another time for you to pause. You can go back and look at some of the slides. Take a look at the questions and the comments that you wrote down at the beginning. What do you think about that now? What are your thoughts on stretching? Should you stretch? Is it good? Is it bad? What do you think? Go ahead and pause now and write down some answers to your thoughts that you had at the beginning. Maybe even write down more questions that you might have at this point. Maybe you have more questions, which is great. We can discuss those further. And there's one more slide after this. So just pause and write down some things that you think. And then when you're ready, go to the next slide. All right. Should you stretch? These are my thoughts based on my knowledge of muscle structure and function and the research that's out there on stretching. And some of the training tactics that have come about in the early 21st century are understanding of how to train people for different sports specific goals or for just different exercise goals is increasingly changing. We're just learning so much more about how the body operates, how muscles work. So do you need to stretch? Many people just inherently think stretching is good, or it's something they've always been told to do. So, back in like the even since like the 1940s, if you look back to like World War I, World War II, that's when like human performance stuff really started to be developed. People, we had these huge wars that we were involved in as a country, and people started looking at human performance. How can a lot of human performance stuff comes out of the military, because we want our humans to perform the best that they can on the battlefield, right? So at that point in time, and then if we go towards the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, we're like bodybuilding and stuff like that. Arnold Schwarzenegger started to become really popular. Stretching started to become this, well, you stretch, you just do, right? The research was still really young, but people started to think that, hey, if you can't touch your toes, that's bad news. Or I got to be able to stretch, right? It's just you stretch, and then the NFL, Major League Baseball, you had all these sports where the science was just continuously developing, and you just had, you would have athletes go out before they perform and before they practice, and they would do static stretching. Some probably still do. Maybe you still do. That's not a bad thing necessarily, but a lot of the research and a lot of the sports science is coming out and showing that don't just think that static stretching is something you should do. It should have a very specific purpose, right? And a lot of times what we're figuring out is it's very, very individualized. If you have 50 people on your football team, or 50 people on your volleyball team, or if you go into a weight room with 5 or 6 of your friends, should every single person in those groups be doing the exact same stretches? No, not in my opinion, not based on what I know from the science that's out there now. Stretching is a tool, just like a dumbbell, just like a barbell. Do you always need to use a barbell in the weight room? Should you always use a medicine ball? Should you always use a kettlebell? No, it really depends on what your goal is. And that's how stretching is too, right? Static or dynamic. It really depends on what your goal is and what your individual needs are. And I would go so far to say as just blanket prescribing static stretching for just a big group of people. At this point, 2021, going into 2022, I would say that's probably not the best thing to do, just to have an entire group of people do static stretching just because that's what we've always done, right? That can get into some stuff that's a little dangerous, right? Because you might have 2 people standing next to one another, and one person has perfectly flexible hamstrings. They don't need to stretch, right? Dynamic stretching has really started to become a very, very useful tool, especially for sport performance. And so my suggestion would be, if you really want to start working on being more flexible, you feel like you need more range of motion, dynamic stretching should be, in my opinion, the first thing that you try. So maybe a yoga routine with constant movement, or there's just so many different mobility types of exercises out there where you're moving through different ranges of motion, but you're not necessarily stopping and holding. Now, static stretching, don't take this to say that static stretching is bunk and that you should never use it. That is not what I'm saying, because there are a lot of people who can use static stretching. It's a great tool. It's just based on your individual goals and needs, right? If you want to be a gymnast, if you want to be able to twist better in your golf swing or your baseball swing, you might be able to use static stretching as a tool for that. It's that magic phrase in most science. It depends. It just depends. So if we ever get to a point where we're saying you should just stretch, you should always static stretch before you work out, that the science really doesn't support that anymore. Last but not least, static stretching can have a parasympathetic benefit, which is really good. That's something that a lot of people in our world need today because our society is really hyped up a lot of the time, really jazzed up. You got the blue light from your phones. You're really never turning your brain off. So being able to come back down is really important. If static stretching can be a tool for you for that, that's great. There are other tools that you can use to get a parasympathetic benefit, deep breathing, meditation, different forms of exercise, particularly aerobic exercise, can be a great parasympathetic stimulus. So again, I guess the end thing here would be is stretching is a tool. Is it right for you? Well, it depends. And so I think the science can really lead you in the direction that might give you an idea of what's right for you. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to ask.